The Bedford Incident is easily one of the most criminally overlooked Cold War thrillers ever committed to celluloid. A film so unnervingly precise in its final 5 minutes that it arguably out-Kubrick's Kubrick himself. So, let's take a look behind the scenes of the movie with 20 dark things you didn't know about the Bedford Incident, including the Oscar-winning star who demanded a completely different role than the one written for him, the bitter creative split that directly birthed this film from the wreckage of Dr. Strangelove, and the real reason the entire United States Navy told the production to go find its own ship. Now, to understand the Bedford Incident, you first have to understand the man who made it. James B. Harris is not a name that trips off the tongue the way Kubrick, Lumet, or Frankenheimer does. But in the early 1960s, Harris was arguably the most important producer in Hollywood that nobody talked about. He was the architect behind The Killing, Paths of Glory, and Lolita, three of Stanley Kubrick's foundational early masterworks. Without Harris's financing, his relationships, his sheer business acumen, it is entirely possible that Stanley Kubrick remains an obscure photographer from the Bronx. So when the two men finally parted ways, it was a genuinely seismic event. And the reason they split is where the story of the Bedford Incident actually begins. While developing what would eventually become Dr. Strangelove, Kubrick began gravitating hard toward dark comedy, absurdist satire, nervous laughter poured directly over the machinery of nuclear annihilation. Harris was appalled. He pushed back, reportedly convinced that treating the subject of nuclear war as farce would be catastrophic for both of their careers. Kubrick, as history judged it, was right. Dr. Strangelove is now regarded as an undisputed magnum opus of American cinema. But Harris left the partnership, determined to make the nuclear thriller he still believed in, the straight, gritty, deadly serious version. And that film was The Bedford Incident. What makes this split so dramatically rich is that both men were right about the same material, in opposite directions. Kubrick's version said, the only sane response to nuclear annihilation is laughter. Harris's version said, no, the only honest response is dread. The audience of 1965 got to see both answers within 12 months of each other. That is an extraordinary accident of film history. So Harris went all in, personally. According to trade reports from 1964, he paid $100,000 of his own money to option the rights to Mark Raskovich's 1963 debut novel, The Bedford Incident, a gripping, tightly wound story of obsession and nuclear brinkmanship set entirely aboard a U.S. Navy destroyer in the frozen North Atlantic. That is a staggering personal investment for a first-time director with no studio safety net underneath him. Just a former producer betting his own savings on a story he believed could genuinely shake an audience. Harris had arranged the financing for Dr. Strangelove before leaving Kubrick. He knew exactly what a serious Cold War film cost to make and what it required to sell. He went in with open eyes. That, in retrospect, is either the most reckless or the most calculated move in the entire production's history. Now, what drew Harris to the Raskovich novel so powerfully was its literary architecture, because The Bedford Incident is, at its core, a revisionist retelling of Moby Dick. Captain Eric Finlander, the commanding officer of the USS Bedford, is Ahab. Obsessive, brilliant, dangerously singular in his focus. The Soviet submarine he is hunting is the White Whale. There is even a moment in the film where a character looks Finlander in the eye and tells him directly he is not chasing whales now, a wink at the source material so overt it barely qualifies as subtext. Raskovich built that connection into the DNA of the novel, and screenwriter James Poe, a proven Hollywood craftsman who had worked on the adaptation of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, preserved it faithfully in the script. The genius of the conceit is what it does to the audience's sympathies. Because we know how Moby Dick ends. We know what happens to Ahab. The film tells you from the very first scene exactly where this is going, and then dares you to believe it will really go there. So Harris acquired the rights, hired Poe, and then discovered he had competition. Richard Widmark, one of the most recognizable and powerful stars in Hollywood, had also read Raskovich's novel and wanted it. In a lesser town, that standoff could have gotten ugly, but Harris was a producer by trade. He recognized a deal when it was standing right in front of him. He brought Widmark on as both lead actor and co-producer through Widmark's own production company, Heath Productions. Suddenly, The Bedford Incident had a major star attached, and that star had a significant financial stake in making the movie as good as possible. And Widmark had something to prove by the mid-1960s. He had exploded into cinema consciousness back in 1947 with his debut in Kiss of Death, playing the psychopathic villain, Tommy Udo. A role so electric, so terrifyingly unhinged that it earned him an Academy Award nomination and permanently branded him as Hollywood's go-to heavy. Widmark spent the better part of 2 decades fighting that label, film by film. Captain Finlander was the role that finally allowed him to transcend it entirely. Not a villain, not quite a hero, but something genuinely more interesting. A brilliant, driven, morally certain man who is also quietly and catastrophically wrong. Variety, reviewing the finished film in 1965, called it one of the finest performances of Widmark's entire career. They were not wrong. The restraint he brings to Finlander, the way the obsession is always controlled, never operatic, is what makes the ending so viscerally frightening. He never seems like a madman. He seems like the most rational man on the ship. That is precisely the point. Now, this is where a piece of casting history that most people have never heard of comes into play. The role of the ship's doctor, Lieutenant Commander Chester Potter, the moral conscience of the USS Bedford, was written specifically with Sidney Poitier in mind. Harris and Widmark reached out to Poitier directly following James Poe's commission in late 1963. But Poitier read the script, sat with it, and came back to Harris with a counteroffer. He didn't want to be the doctor, he wanted to be Ben Munsford, the journalist, the civilian aboard entirely against Finlander's wishes, there to write a profile piece who watches the entire situation spiral toward catastrophe with growing and eventually desperate alarm. Poitier understood instinctively that Munsford was the film's moral center, the audience's surrogate, and he was not about to play second chair to that dramatic function. So Harris renegotiated. Poitier got Munsford. Martin Balsam, brilliant as ever, stepped into the role of the doctor instead. So Columbia Pictures executive Mike Frankovich signed off on the deal, and what followed was quietly revolutionary. Sidney Poitier received co-equal star billing with Richard Widmark. In 2025, that sounds unremarkable. In 1965, it was not. Poitier wrote about it in his memoir with characteristic directness, noting that the decision caused some in the industry to raise their eyebrows in outright disapproval, while others applauded it as a step that was long overdue. He singled out Frankovich and Harris as men with a rare sense of fair play in an industry not exactly known for it. However, the billing was not even the most historically significant element of Poitier's participation. Here is the real landmark. The Bedford Incident was the first film in Sidney Poitier's 15-year screen career in which his race was neither mentioned nor relevant, not referenced by any other character, not woven into the plot, not weaponized as dramatic conflict. Ben Munsford was simply a journalist, a smart, principled, morally clear human being who happened to be black, in a story that didn't find that fact particularly interesting. That sounds like an elementary baseline. In the American cinema of 1965, it was genuinely radical. It was also, in retrospect, the most sophisticated political statement the film makes, not in its dialogue, not in its plot, but in the simple act of casting a black man as the only person on the ship who is consistently, demonstrably correct about what is happening. And consider where Poitier was standing when he made that choice. In 1964, he had become the first black man in the history of Hollywood to win the Academy Award for Best Actor for Lilies of the Field, making him the most discussed and celebrated actor in America. He was at the absolute summit of his cultural moment, and he chose to spend that capital on a Cold War naval thriller with no love interest, no conventional heroism, shot almost entirely inside the cramped corridors of a warship. That was a conscious artistic decision from a man who knew exactly what he was doing. So principal photography got underway and almost immediately hit a wall. Harris submitted the completed screenplay to the United States Department of Defense requesting cooperation and access to an actual U.S. Navy destroyer. The Pentagon's answer was no, flat refusal. The Defense Department objected to how the Navy was portrayed. Specifically, the implication that a highly trained American commander could, through sheer psychological obsession, accidentally trigger a nuclear exchange. The idea that such a man could exist within the United States military was, from Washington's perspective, unacceptable. It is worth pausing on that refusal for a moment, because what the Pentagon was essentially doing was confirming the film's central argument. The scenario was implausible. They said, no American commander would behave this way. The Bedford Incident spent the next 2 hours demonstrating, in granular and forensic detail, exactly how he would. So Harris improvised. He turned to the British Royal Navy. The opening shots of the USS Bedford, supposedly an ultra-modern American-guided missile destroyer, were actually filmed using HMS Wakeful, a British Type 15 frigate with the pennant number F159 clearly visible on its hull in some shots. The interior scenes were captured aboard HMS Trowbridge, another Type 15 vessel. Now, if you watch the film closely, and it rewards close watching days, you can spot Lee Enfield rifles racked in the ship's corridors, standard British military issue. You can also clock the distinctively forward sloping bridge windows unique to the Type 15 class, found on no American destroyer of the era. The Pentagon refused to play. So Harris quietly cast the Royal Navy in their place, and the general cinema-going audience of 1965 never blinked. The rest of the film was produced at Shepperton Studios in England, with additional naval footage captured at the Malta film facilities in the Mediterranean, where Harris and the crew spent approximately 8 weeks working in warm, Maltese sunshine, shooting what was supposed to be the freezing, punishing waters off the coast of Greenland. A large-scale model of the Bedford was also constructed and filmed in the Shepperton tank. The logistical artifice required to make the Bedford Incident look like what it needed to look like was, in every sense of the word, considerable. The production then returned to Shepperton to complete principal photography, meaning that a film set entirely in one of the most inhospitable stretches of ocean on Earth was made, from first frame to last, without a single day of filming anywhere near it. Now, the man behind the camera for all of this was Gilbert Taylor, and his presence on this production is one of those connections that sounds almost too neat to be true. Taylor had just finished shooting Dr. Strangelove for Stanley Kubrick. He would later go on to shoot Star Wars for George Lucas. The same pair of eyes that framed the war room and Slim Pickens riding the bomb also framed the icy North Atlantic sequences of the Bedford Incident, and would eventually frame that opening shot of a Star Destroyer cutting across the top of the screen. Taylor himself described his work here as part of what he called a loose trilogy of end-of-the-world films alongside Strangelove and the earlier 7 Days to Noon. Shot in crisp, high-contrast black and white, the cinematography gives the Bedford's patrol sequences a near-documentary quality, which only makes the final act land harder, like footage from a newsreel that hasn't been broadcast yet. The choice of black and white in 1965 was already a deliberate act of artistic positioning. Color was standard by then. Taylor and Harris chose monochrome because it anchored the film to the tradition of wartime documentary, a visual argument that what you were watching was real, or could be, or already had been somewhere, and you simply hadn't heard about it yet. However, even a production this disciplined had its blunders. The Soviet intelligence vessel that the Bedford is trailing throughout the film is supposedly named the Novosibirsk, a real Russian city. But on the hull of the prop ship used in filming, the name is rendered not in Cyrillic as it would be on any vessel actually belonging to the Soviet Navy, but in the Latin alphabet, and it's misspelled Novosibirsk in large, clear lettering on the side of a boat in a film whose entire dramatic premise hinges on military precision. It's the kind of continuity error that would have had Captain Finlander logging someone for insubordination. So, buried deep in the ship's manifest, credited and easy to miss, is a name that history treated far more generously than this film had the opportunity to. Donald Sutherland, who would go on to headline The Dirty Dozen, MASH, Clute, and Ordinary People, appears here as Hospital Man Nerney. He's stationed in the sickbay. He has almost no lines. He is there and then he is gone. But the Bedford Incident was among Donald Sutherland's very first feature film appearances. A young Canadian actor working the United Kingdom circuit in the mid-1960s, picking up whatever was available. The Central Intelligence Agency would later place Sutherland on a formal watch list for his anti-war activism. He spent the rest of his career making films that made governments uncomfortable. It started here on a fictional warship in a film about exactly the kind of institutional madness he would spend 40 years opposing. The irony is almost too complete to be accidental. Now, what elevates the Bedford Incident above the standard Cold War procedural is the screenplay's geopolitical triangulation. On board the Bedford alongside Finlander and Munsford is Commodore Wolfgang Schrepke, a German NATO observer played by the British character actor Eric Portman. Schrepke is a former World War II U-boat ace, a man who once stalked Allied shipping through the North Atlantic from exactly the kind of vessel that Finlander is now hunting. He is the only character aboard who fully understands what Finlander is doing, and he is the only character with the moral authority and the raw experience to say, directly to the captain's face, "This is insane." Portman had, interestingly, played a German officer in uniform before, most memorably in the Powell and Pressburger wartime classic 49th Parallel, back in 1941. He brings the full freight of that history to Schrepke, a man who has seen what obsession looks like when it goes wrong, from both sides of the periscope. Schrepke is the film's most quietly devastating character, precisely because he is the one who knows the ending before it arrives and cannot stop it anyway. But nothing in the Bedford Incident is more devastating than its final 2 minutes. And this is precisely where the film earns its permanent place in the Cold War cinema canon alongside Dr. Strangelove and Lumet's Fail Safe. In the climax, a push to the edge Finlander stands on the bridge and utters his now infamous line, not as an order, but as a statement of standing policy. The Bedford, I'll never fire first, but if he fires one, I'll fire one. Young Ensign Ralston, the most junior officer on the ship, his nerves destroyed by days of sustained general quarters, run raw by Finlander's relentless psychological pressure, hears the words, fire one, and he pulls the trigger. He launches a nuclear torpedo at the Soviet submarine. The sub retaliates. The screen goes dark. There is no resolution. No hero survives to explain what happened. There is just the visual of the film's celluloid appearing to melt, the medium literally consuming itself, and then silence. It is one of the most chilling final sequences in the history of American cinema, and it costs nothing to produce beyond the nerve to actually go through with it. Reportedly, 2 distinct versions of that ending were cut. In the version most widely seen, mutual annihilation is implied, the torpedo is fired, the submarine retaliates, the Bedford is destroyed. In an alternate cut, Schrepke survives long enough to be discovered alone that evening, aiming a .45 caliber pistol at the nose cone of a live, armed nuclear warhead. Whether he intends to trigger it manually, or whether he simply needs to look directly at the thing that has defined his entire adult life, is left completely open. It is arguably the bleaker of the 2 endings, and the more honest one. Either way, both versions share the same essential statement, that what you have just witnessed is not a story about a bad captain. It is a story about a system, a set of pressures, incentives, and structures that produces this outcome reliably without requiring any individual to be a villain. That is the argument that made the Pentagon refuse to cooperate. It was also the argument that time has entirely vindicated. So here is a final production detail that speaks directly to what Harris believed he had made. In the autumn of 1965, before any commercial release, Harris and Poitier personally took the film to 10 American universities. Not movie palaces, not industry trade screenings, lecture halls. The film was designed from the beginning to function as an argument, a commissioned case against the logic of nuclear escalation, presented to the people most likely to be sent to fight the war it depicted. Its premiere was then staged simultaneously in cities built around U.S. naval installations: New London, Connecticut, San Diego, California, Corpus Christi, Texas, Norfolk, Virginia. It was a distribution strategy as politically precise as the film itself. Harris was not selling a movie, he was making a case. The question he was putting to his audience was not whether they enjoyed it. It was whether they believed it. And if they believed it, what exactly they intended to do about it. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times was not persuaded. Writing in November of 1965, Crowther argued that the film transcended plausibility for any moderately wised-up viewer. As he put it, because of what he called the gross exaggeration of a highly improbable episode. He laid the blame squarely at the feet of screenwriter James Poe, concluding that the premise demanded more credibility than the production could manufacture. But nowadays, The Bedford Incident is widely viewed as one of the most prophetic political thrillers that Hollywood has ever produced. And the gap between Crowther's assessment and history's verdict is genuinely vertiginous. We now know from declassified documents that the Cuban Missile Crisis, still a raw and recent memory when this film was in production, came far closer to accidental nuclear exchange than anyone in the public understood in 1965. We know that the Soviet submarine B-59 came within a single officer's veto. 9 came within a single officer's veto of launching a nuclear torpedo at the U.S. naval blockade. We know that commanders on both sides were operating under grinding, sustained, sleep-deprived pressure. We know that the line between stating a policy and issuing an order can dissolve entirely when the men receiving it are exhausted, frightened, and trained to respond instantaneously. Crowther called it implausible. History, with its declassified files, called it a documentary. The Bedford Incident did not need a sequel. It needed 30 years of geopolitical transparency. And it got them. But let me know below, when it comes to Cold War cinema, which do you think cuts deeper? The Bedford Incident's grim, straight-faced realism, or Dr. Strangelove's pitch-black satire? Is it better to laugh at the apocalypse or to stare it directly and unflinchingly in the face?